Hi, everybody. My name is Imani Phillips. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator for the Jacksonville Public Library. I want to take a moment here to introduce you to our partner from MOCA Jacksonville, Chloe Buffington, who's the Community Program Coordinator. And thank you, Chloe, and also the rest of MOCA Jacksonville for partnering with the library to create the Art and Conversation series. And please just take a second to just tell us a little bit more about MOCA.
Yeah, of course. MOCA is the Museum of Contemporary Art. We're located downtown, right next to where the main library is. We are very excited to be partnering with the library. This is the second of 3 art and conversation programs that we have surrounding our Doug Eng exhibition. Which is a very cool exhibition. If you guys haven't come out and see it, please do. We do a couple other things with the library, including a free day for the anyone with a library card. It's the last Friday of the month, so we did miss the one for September, but the one in October should be coming up on October 29th, so it's like right before Halloween, and the Doug Eng exhibition will still be up then. And then I am going to link our website down in the chat if you guys want to go check it out. I believe Imani included a virtual exhibition. We take photos, and so you can take a tour through the exhibition itself if you haven't had a chance to come out and see it yet, or you're not able to. And it is also on our website. So please check that out. Yes, and I just sent it in. So, all righty, yeah, thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Chloe.
Of course.
All right, and thank you all for joining us for this lit chat with historian Leslie Kemp Poole. She is the author of Saving Florida, Women's Fight for the Environment in the 20th Century. She's also the author of Maitland, and she is the co-editor of The Wilder Heart of Florida, and you can find all these books at the Jacksonville Public Library. Dr. Poole is an associate professor of environmental studies at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. You may also recognize her from 2 PBS documentaries, In Marjorie's Wake and The Swamp. And you might even recognize her from her previous career. Prior to joining academia, Dr. Poole worked as a reporter for several newspapers. So thank you so much for being here, and welcome to Jacksonville. Our moderator for tonight is historian Dr. Charles Klausman from the University of North Florida. Dr. Klausman specializes in histories of Germany, Europe, and the environment. He has several published articles and reviews relating to the topic of environmental history, and he is the editor of War and the Environment, Military Destruction in the Modern Age. Dr. Klausman also has a great interest in environmental history in our community, and his courses, he encourages his students to explore and research environmental issues in Jacksonville, Florida. And you can actually find some of his work along with some of his students' work at UNF Special Collections. Dr. Klausman, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
All right. Thank you for having me. And I'm looking forward to having an interesting conversation this evening with Dr. Klausman and also with all of you. So please feel free to put questions into the chat at the end of our evening together. I'm going to start with a quick PowerPoint that will illustrate some of the really fabulous women who have been part of Florida's environmental movement in the last 100 years. I should tell you that this book came out of my research from my PhD program at the University of Florida, and has the thesis was how involved were women in the environment. And I barely had to scratch the surface to find they were incredibly involved. Whether their names got put on it or not might be another story, but certainly their work, and especially through grassroots, since women really have never been the political power weight in this state. It's a real demonstration for all of us as to how to kind of create power and create change, even though you may be considered individually powerless. So let me start by sharing my screen and sharing the PowerPoint with you. And please, somebody give me a heads up if it's working. Is it working? It's working. Yay!
Yes.
Okay. So again, my topic is looking at women's fight for the environment in the 20th century. And I have stolen photos from my friend Clay Henderson from a lot of different sources to try to illustrate some of this as well. Before we start talking about what happened in the 20th century, it's really important to understand what was happening in the years before that. And the idea of conservation is really a relatively new idea in American history. When the early settlers came to North America, they just saw a land of plenty that they thought would have endless resources. And how could it ever possibly disappear? But by the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was clear that the word extinction was going to be happening in the United States. Some of the most iconic images, the bison that once were 60 million strong and covered the American continent, including they were once found in Payne's Prairie in North Florida, were near extinction. Just a couple hundred still lived, a small group in Yellowstone and others in zoos on the East Coast. Otherwise, they might have disappeared. Passenger pigeons, I mean, an incredible number. 3 to 5 billion once darkened the skies. The descriptions of them are just enormous. But by 1914, the last one, Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo. A very sad story. Now, to find a passenger pigeon, you have to go to a natural history museum and find a stuffed version. The last Carolina parakeet, which once were in Florida, Florida had parakeets, died in the same zoo in 1918. And so this idea that resources could disappear and would disappear leads Americans to start embracing the idea of conservation, of better, more scientific, wise use of resources and trying to save important resources to us. We were talking earlier, there was a sad report this week about 23 species that have been declared extinct in the past week, among them the ivory-billed woodpecker, which also once was in Florida. And it's just another sad step that none of us want to see happen. And indeed, the Florida activist women certainly did not. So one of the earliest actions that women got engaged in was the disappearing birds in Florida, because birds became more valuable as adornments on ladies' hats. And as you can see from this picture, it wasn't just feathers, but it was also bodies of birds that were being used by the thousands in order to support this very wealthy business that was centered in New York and in Europe. On the right, you can see an egret in full nesting plumage. Those special plumes were what were sought by, plume hunters who could go into a rookery and kill hundreds of birds, just take these specialty feathers and then leave the birds dead and their babies and eggs untended. So it was 2 generations really that died in the course of this. And it was the knowledge that birds were disappearing and that they were being used for women's fashions that drew a lot of women into activism in the Audubon Society movement, which started in the Northeast and in Florida was incorporated in 1900 in the city of Maitland. Another first for women, they created Florida's first state park. Even though the state of Florida doesn't recognize it, they did. Through the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs, which was an umbrella group for women's clubs across the state, they gathered together and got a land donation from Henry Flagler's widow, and then went to the state legislature and asked the state legislature to match the acreage in order to save what became Royal Palm State Park. It had been known as Paradise Key. It was a small rise in the Everglades that had a lot of botanical beauty and really unique species, and it had birds. And so not only did the women convince the legislature, again in 1916, before they had the vote, they convinced the legislature to set aside this land. And then when the legislature wouldn't fund it, the women did. They raised the money for many years before the legislature finally started kicking in some operating funds. And as you can see in the picture on the right, they even built a lodge that would house scientists and visitors who wanted to come and explore this important science at the park. Again, because the women held onto the park and ultimately it became part of Everglades National Park, it was never recognized as a state park because the state never owned it. So there you go, semantics. But indeed, it was the first state park in the United States created by women's clubs and was very much celebrated across the country. And the leader of the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs at the time was Mann Jennings, who I would argue is one of the most powerful women in Florida politics in the last century. And she was from Jacksonville. I think that's a point of great pride for people in Jacksonville. May was interested in creating the state park, but she was also known as the mother of Florida forestry because of her concerns about what was happening with Florida's forest resources. The picture on the upper left is a picture of what had once been a beautiful longleaf pine plantation. And the usual practices before this conservation idea was to cut and move on because you could, because it just were so many forests and it just seemed like they would never disappear. But May worked a lot with men in order to create new forestry regulations in Florida and to try to force better management of Florida's trees. Here's an example of the Garden Club of Jacksonville, and May was a member of this. Women worked for city beautification, and in Jacksonville, they helped save treaty oak, which I have never seen, but it looks just fabulous. They worked to save it in 1935 and donated it to the city. And it was through, again, the garden clubs, which are largely female, who worked together in order to convince the city of Jacksonville to create this park as well. They also ran a couple of campaigns for conservation, Save the Trees and Make Jacksonville Green. And again, it was about city beautification, but it was also about saving something historically significant about the environment. There are three Marjories who had a large impact on Florida: Marjorie Canaan Rawlings, the writer; Marjorie Harris Carr, who fought the Florida Barge Canal project in the 1960s; and then the most famous Marjorie of all, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who is most associated with the Florida Everglades. She wrote the book in 1947 called Everglades, River of Grass, which finally helped everyone understand what the Everglades were: a large expanse of sheet flow of fresh water that moved south, actually beginning in the Orlando area, moving through Lake Okeechobee and all the way to the tip of Florida. Interestingly, Douglas was not an activist after she wrote the book. She was definitely involved in getting the national park created in 1947, but she didn't do any activism work again until she was in her late 70s. And it was because the city of Miami had proposed a large jet port in part of what is now Big Cypress Swamp. And she was challenged to get involved and said, well, I wrote the book, but the activists said, well, we need you to do more than that. So what she ended up doing was creating a grassroots group called Friends of the Everglades, and started showing up at hearings. And at age 79, and she was kind of tiny, and she had really bad eyesight and wore these great big glasses and was known for her floppy hats. But she, as she would say, the developers can't be mean to me. I'm a little old lady, but I can certainly be rude to them. And she would stand up for and try to fight any kind of development or regulations or rules that she thought threatened her beloved Everglades. And hey, this is the power of one woman. And when you live to be 108, you can get a lot done. Another issue that brings women into the environmental movement in the 20th century is air and water pollution. Nobody moved to Florida in order to have dirty air or dirty water. And you'll see in the picture on the bottom right, that was a power plant in Jacksonville. And it was reported one day in the 1950s that women's hose melted on their legs from the pollution in the air. And when it became a problem, not just of aesthetics, but also of health, of people getting asthma, of dirty water that couldn't be drunk, of fish kills, women got involved, including the League of Women Voters became a big activist group just in Florida and also around the nation. Endangered species bring women into the activism. Shirley Reynolds and Rita Alexander had been scouring the beaches of Volusia County, worried about sea turtles there, and especially their young, who, when they hatch, follow moonlight theoretically into the ocean, where they're going to spend their next, their adult life, or grow to adulthood and spend their lives before they come back and nest. But what they discovered was that lights from condos and commercial properties along the coastline were distracting these turtles that were getting killed on roads, which just seemed insane. So the women asked the county government to do something about regulating lights. And when they were ignored and even vilified for suggesting that, they went to federal court and sued under the Endangered Species Act and won an injunction that said that Volusia County, and it spread to all Florida coastal counties, had to have some light regulations during sea turtle season. And now we all live with that. But it was because these two women were willing to take on that issue and go to court. Judith Valley was standing in her backyard in Fort Lauderdale and looking at the new river and seeing boats speeding by, and was quite concerned that manatees might be injured. And when she went to ask the local board to do something about setting speed limits, one man suggested that she just go out in her yard and just throw tomatoes at the boats as they went by, which was not a good thing to say to Judith, because it really got her angry and got her motivated. And she began working with the Florida Audubon Society and ultimately helped found the Save the Manatee Club, which I would argue now is one of the greatest marketing programs ever for an endangered species in the world, because we love manatees. People around the world love manatees. But it was this early recognition of their problems and a effort started by this woman that really has helped put them on the international scene as well. Endangered Lands get women involved. Doris Leeper, known as Doc, was worried about what was happening to the seashore and near her home, and saw people cutting through the dunes and development proposed. And she ended up working very hard with local folks to create Canaveral National Seashore, which is the longest stretch of undeveloped coast on the Atlantic in the state of Florida. If you haven't been there, you must go. It is amazing, but it gives us a glimpse of what the Florida coastline once looked like. And if it wasn't for Doc Leeper really creating a fuss and fighting the male establishment, it might not be there now. Environmental justice also bring women into the environmental movement. The understanding that the people who are most often hurt by a degraded environment, by polluted water, by filthy air, tend to be poor and minorities who have little or no political power at all. And so two activists that I really admire who've been involved in this movement are Joy Tolsey-Zell and Jeannie Economos. Joy has been fighting for over 30 years to try to clean up the Finn Holloway River, which is on Florida's Big Bend coast, because it has been designated until recently as an industrial river, which allowed a pulp mill to dump any kind of toxins into the river that it wanted to. The state of Florida deemed that it was worth getting the business of the mill in order to, and the river could be expended. And as a result, they dumped not only a lot of chemicals, but the chemical dioxin, which is considered one of the most cancer-causing chemicals in the environment today. Joy has been working really hard to clean it up. Just recently, the company found a solution, which was to take all of its waste on a pipeline and simply dump it straight into the Gulf of Mexico. I don't know that that resolves anything for anybody, but that was their way of trying to skirt this Joy's continuous pressure. Jeannie Economos has been working with Lake Apopka farm workers, many of whom lost their jobs and livelihoods when a restoration project was created on Lake Apopka. Lake Apopka is widely considered the most polluted lake in Florida, and it was a result of, in many ways, from agricultural chemicals that not only went into the lake, but that were sprayed on the farm workers as they worked. But there's never been any kind of large-scale health investigation as to what the effects were on farm workers. And in this picture, you can see she's standing next to a quilt that was made as kind of a mimic to the AIDS quilt from the 80s. Each one of those panels represents a different farm worker who has died of a disease that's suspected to be related to those agricultural chemicals. So if you're not interested in birds and you're not interested in the air, you might be interested in what's happened to the people who are affected by this. And all of these different issues bring Florida women into the environmental movement. Early on, they can't vote, but they can work together in groups to create pressure on the state legislature. By mid-century, they can lead groups like Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, creating her own grassroots group, putting pressure on developers to save the Everglades. And then we see many different areas that bring women in the late 20th century to try to make a difference. And I've documented this in my book, Saving Florida. And thank you, library, for buying a copy of it for your readers. And I also just wanted to mention and show you a picture of my newest book that's out, The Wilder Heart of Florida, which is a series of essays by different writers around in Florida. And the idea is, if we want people to care about the environment, we need to make them love it, just like we do. And so that's the purpose of this new book. And I hope that you'll, have things to tell me or stories to tell me that I haven't heard about, inspiring women in Florida as we go through this evening. So that's it for my PowerPoint. I will go back to our conversation.
Okay. So I guess I'll ask you a few questions about this. I find the whole subject completely fascinating. And just an observation, there is a really interesting and quite funny, if anybody ever watches the TV channel Funny or Die, there's a really funny episode of Funny or Die called Drunk History, and it's about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and it's really, really funny. But anyway, just a couple questions. I mean, this is such a big topic, and I think I've learned a little bit more, answered a couple of my questions just from what you said, but it's such a big topic. How did you decide which women or organizations to look at?
I just started off looking at women's clubs just to see what they were up to, and the Florida Audubon Society, which was actually one of the few organizations that had men and women involved in it. And what I finally ended up seeing is, I could write a whole book probably about each county in Florida, but I wanted to extend and show that this reach went statewide. So I really tried to keep it regional, go to every section of the state from the Keys to Pensacola and find women activists in all of those areas.
Mm-hmm. Because it just seems like such a massive topic. And kind of along the same lines, how long did this process take of doing the research and actually writing the book?
Well, it started with my dissertation. So that was a 7-year project. I started this off with my very first class and continued from there. And I have to say, as a former journalist, I didn't want to just look at books. So I was trying to interview activists as well. And I knew a lot of them had died along the way, in the years that I'd been interested in all of this. So I really made an effort to do interviews with people and let them tell me their stories. And then they would refer me to other issues and people that I needed to talk to. And I kind of became overwhelmed with a lot of information and eventually had to say, I have to stop now. But as you all probably know, stories that aren't in the book, it continues on.
Yeah, it just seems like something that could just go on forever. And I'm sure, there's communities you can't cover. I think it's really interesting how much emphasis there is on Jacksonville in the book. And I'd kind of forgotten about that until I looked at it again. And I'd forgotten that Mann Jennings lived in Jacksonville. But for students out there who are interested in topics, I think there's a lot to be done with Jacksonville, and this is a good place to start. Thinking about some of the women you write about, Mann Jennings, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, Marjorie Harris Carr, is it Joy Ezell, some of these women who have been fighting these battles and campaigning, what would you say have been the most essential qualities of the most successful of these activists? What made them so successful, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's kind of a combination. They were great leaders, and part of that is they were good communicators. They were good organizers. They were good at collecting facts and data to back up what they believed was true. And they wouldn't take no for an answer. They firmly believed that what they were doing was right, and that the public would eventually understand that. And it's just amazing. It's almost, Joy Ezell is almost like a She is so determined, but she's also so optimistic. She's been fighting this battle for 30 years, but she still, has a belief that she can make things change. And that's just an incredible talent, I think.
Yeah. And Joy Ezell leads me to another question, which is what motivated some of these folks to just keep on fighting when they get hate mail, when they get death threats, especially with these very technical issues concerning pollution levels in water and designations under the Clean Water Act. How does somebody like Joy Ezell keep on going on? I mean, the story of the Fenn Holloway River is just kind of shocking in a way. I mean, why wouldn't she just give up and move to a different,
Well, I mean, that's a good question for all of them. I think that they just absolutely loved Florida.
Yeah.
Joy grew up near the Fenn Holloway River. Mann Jennings grew up in rural Florida and loved it. I mean, these women had a real passion and love for the land, and they were just not going to be stopped. And they didn't care what the Chamber of Commerce had to say. Mm-hmm. They didn't care, about, jobs and such. And I'm talking in a broad sense. There were certainly women who disagreed with them, but they just believed that it needed to be done. And especially when you start to find pollution and issues that are affecting the health of your children, I mean, it's a mama bear situation.
Yeah.
You don't want to fight with them, and they can't see another alternative. Their family is threatened.
Yeah, it's a kind of single-mindedness that's just quite remarkable. The other thing that struck me is especially, to me, one of the most fascinating characters is Marjorie Harris Carr, because she was so impactful. I mean, sort of a standard understanding we have of environmental history and environmental activism in Florida is that the fight over the Cross Florida Barge Canal really galvanized a lot of environmentalists in Florida. But what's fascinating about her is how flexible she was in her use of tactics. And she was willing to be portrayed as a housewife who sat at home and just was fighting for what she thought was right, or a little old lady in tennis shoes. But she could also be sort of flinty, and the best word is sort of chippy when there's a discussion of her calling up a state representative and say, why aren't you spending more time on this right now? And I'm especially impressed by people like that who were willing to be so flexible and operate in all these different political environments, engage with male politicians and male businessmen, but also, be immersed in the science. I mean, she had a scientific training, which was, all very impressive. I have lots of other questions. Another question that sort of gets back to when you were talking about how you got interested in all this and your role as a journalism. And the question is, it concerns your writing style. And maybe this is a lesson for all of us, especially historians, since we don't often think about this. And my question is, how did you learn to write so evocatively? And I think you probably, I'd forgotten about your role as a journalist. I think that's part of the answer. But one thing I like about this book is the evocative sort of jargon-free language. And I'm going to read a passage, and then I want you to just comment on that if you don't mind. And so you say, walking through a long lay forest is akin to visiting an outdoor cathedral. The thick bark trees shoot heavenward. Breezes play a high-pitched hymn through the thin, spiky leaves. And the clean, piney scent is nature's incense. It almost, it's just not the way we're normally trained how to write. I just wonder if you could please comment on how you learned how to write that way.
I've read a lot of fabulous nature writers, and one of the lessons I learned in my PhD program when I was a student, and yes, I feel everybody's pain here who's been a PhD student, is I could write all jargony, all history-ish, language book, and it's going to sit on a shelf somewhere in some obscure place, and no one's going to read it. And as a journalist, I wanted to tell a story. I wanted to get these people to tell their story. And I have to say, one of my favorite things to do is go hiking in a longleaf forest. So I've done it plenty of times myself, and I wanted my readers to understand why these women were so motivated. So thank you. That's a great compliment coming from you.
I just love that passage. And I mean, as a hiker too, I can completely understand that. Another thing that strikes me about these women is how many of them grew up in nature as children, hiking in the woods and things like that. And I think this is an incredibly important formative experience for people. You also mentioned the fact that, they were mostly upper middle class or upper class women who had leisure time and income and the ability to spend time engaged in these sorts of things, which I found really interesting as well. I guess before we sort of open it up for other questions and answers, I wonder if you could comment on some other lessons maybe for aspiring activists or historians. And I guess one question is, what lessons do you draw from this for the present environmental issues that we're dealing with? Things like climate change and things like environmental problems that are not so easily pinpointed. I'm thinking about, to use jargon, non-point source pollution, where it's coming from 1,000 different places. What lessons do you draw from this history that can help us deal with problems like that?
Well, I mean, these women were working, in a almost a different kind of technical time than we are now. But I think they have a lot of great lessons. Number one, you find power in groups. You find power among other people, grassroots movements, petitions. Now we have online petitions. They did written petitions. I think they would love social media. I think they'd be all over it and getting engaged in websites and quick alerts and emails. And they worked the media. They understood how to present a story that the media would be interested in. Like you said, Marjorie Harris Carr had a master's degree in zoology, but she would let them call her a Micanopy housewife if she could get a story out of it. And she got a lot of stories. They loved this housewife versus the Army Corps of Engineers, this David and Goliath story. And so she didn't care as long as it was publicity. I think that the women would teach us that you have to gather facts. You have to be persistent. You have to look at it as a long-term battle. You're not going to win immediately. You have to really believe in yourself. You have to really empower the people around you in your grassroots movement, and you have to be a great communicator. This is what I tell my students. There's a certain number of these women who are like the power of one, like Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. She didn't do it alone. She might have been the leader, but she brought people in with her. And by the end of her life, if you wanted to get elected to be president, you had to get your picture taken with Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, which is just amazing. Or governor. And whereas 100 years earlier, you got elected by promising to drain the Everglades and get rid of them. So they give us, I think, remarkable stories. And I really feel like we are the inheritors of their work. And it's really up to us now to take on whatever it is, to learn the science, to find the messaging, and to try to build a constituency.
And kind of building upon that is, we're in a political environment that's very polarized right now. And I was struck by your discussion of the Republican Party in Florida in the late 60s and early 70s, which was the pro-environmental party. And I wonder how environmentalists today and in the near future can navigate through this very difficult political environment where even suggesting that you're on the side of an environmental issue immediately paints you in one political stripe and you're faced with implacable opposition. I mean, how do you deal with a situation like that?
Well, I think you take somebody out hiking in a pine forest, you help them learn to love it. Like I said, that's the point of my new book. But and what I think is still continuing good news is the Everglades continues to be a very bipartisan issue. It has to be funded every year by the federal government and the state government. And nobody is not going to support the Everglades. So there are issues that we can find bipartisan support for. Certainly, we've seen voters take on the constitutional amendments to demand that money be spent to buy lands up. And I think as long as voters make their voices heard, and this is what I tell my students, number one, if you're going to be an activist, you got to go register to vote, because you can't separate the environment from the political process, as icky as it may feel. And many of my students are very put off by the current atmosphere, but you have got to engage and you've got to make your voices heard. So we have to persevere on. I mean, these women were called all kinds of names and belittled. I mean, things that we wouldn't hear today. So it was not happy politics back then either.
Yeah. And I guess for the history majors and the aspiring history majors, what sort of advice would you give them about tackling topics like this and going through this process?
Find a topic you love. I loved my women. I still love them. I admire them all. And it made it easy. I shouldn't say easy. It made it, I could survive the long, daunting hours of writing, but going out and interviewing people and uncovering stories that hadn't been told, and then compiling them together so that, some women had been highlighted, but when you put them all together, it really helps you understand the depth of their strengths. That's what kept me going, is that I just really was interested in the topic and wanted other people to care.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, before we turn it over to everybody else for questions, do you feel like there are any women or other topics in this narrative that you've written, this very beautifully written narrative, that you wish you could have spent more time on or wish you'd been able to study?
Oh, I have a whole list of women that I never could get hold of, or who wouldn't talk to me, or I ran out of time, or now when I go and do talks around the state, people tell me new stories. I'm like, oh, it's too late, but please tell that story yourself. I mean, that's the thing. Like I said, I feel like I've scratched the surface, and I think you could pick up this book and take it to every state in the nation, and there are going to be women's clubs and garden clubs and League of Women Voters who are working on local environmental issues.
To be a wonderful model for other states doing things this way.
I think it's there.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I think we're going to have a bunch of questions for you. So I think we should go ahead and open it up to questions, if that sounds okay with everybody. So I guess if you forward your questions through chat, I'll take a look at them, and then I will sort of sort through them and read them out loud and let Dr. Poole answer them. Okay, so one of our participants would like to share fl5.org with you, all 5 constitutional amendments to protect Florida water and natural ecosystems. Thank you very much. Any other questions from our group?
That's a good issue to look into. There's 5 constitutional amendments that they're in the process right now of getting enough signatures to get them onto the ballot. And so that sometimes the grassroots simply begins, again, an early petition drive, right, to get something on the ballot.
One person would like to ask, have any of your books been translated to other languages?
I really don't know. I really don't know. That would be pretty awesome if it was, but it's very Florida centric, I know, but I really don't know.
I think there's a lot of people in other countries that are really interested in Florida, though. All you have to do is go to the Everglades.
That's true.
Listen to people walking around on the boardwalk. There's really true.
That's so true. I've been down there in August, which theoretically is the worst time in the year to be in the Everglades. And you hear so many languages, I can't even pick them all out. And it has become, the place to go. If you're coming internationally to Florida, you need to go to the Everglades. And then I find so many Florida residents who've never been there, which is mind-boggling to me. Mm-hmm. But so, all of you, go to the Everglades. Go in January, but go to the Everglades. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, don't go in August. Take lots of bug spray. Other questions? I know there must be some out there. I will pose another one while you're waiting, which is, you mentioned in your introduction, you know, there were some certain topics you just really, you couldn't get around to. And I wonder if there is a book waiting to be written about the history of environmental justice and race in Florida. It sounds like a fascinating topic.
It's on my to-do list. I just finished a new manuscript that I just turned in to the University of Florida Press, and I've been mulling over this environmental justice because I'm finding that it really attracts a different type of person, and my students are very, very interested in this and the idea, you know, that the downtrodden and the social aspects. And I think that a lot of the big environmental groups have failed to recognize that.
Yeah.
And it brings diversity into the movement as well. And I just think for too long we've been worrying about the birds and the alligators, and we should be thinking about the people. And I think the movement's been late to that, but I'm seeing it, and a lot of women have been very engaged in it. So you want to write a chapter, Charles?
Pardon?
Would you like to write a chapter?
I've got one ready to go on this topic.
Great.
Concerns Jacksonville. But there has been an issue related to this in Jacksonville over the years.
I think in just about every city, every part of the state has had environmental justice issues. All you have to do is go on the EPA website and look at where all of the toxic waste commission says. Yeah.
I wonder, okay, so we have some other questions are coming in. One person has the question, what about Black women? Do you know about, I think it's pronounced Maeveen Betch, right? She's the American Beach lady. Do you know about her?
I know about her and I did not include her in the book, and that's my bad. But I did look at some Black activists in Florida, and for much of the period I'm writing about, they were busy dealing with Jim Crow issues. Yeah. And so, you know, saving land wasn't really on their agenda. But they were building parks and forcing some cities to put in at least parks in urban areas, including in Jacksonville and West Palm Beach and Tampa, because the disparity between white neighborhoods having parks and Black neighborhoods not, was very glaring. And that was certainly part of their effort. And certainly women of color have been heavily involved in the environmental justice movement.
Absolutely. And so we have another question. What role, if any, did spirituality play in these women's motivation?
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know that any of them point to their religion, but they certainly shared kind of an aesthetic appreciation for nature. They saw it as something really beautiful that deserved to live and survive. And certainly you see, at least in the Audubon movement, talking about birds who are like humans, who take care of their babies and their nesting. So there is many times where women are identifying with nature. And I don't know if they would outright have said spirituality, but certainly to me, that's part of it is finding peace and spirit in nature as well.
Yeah. Other questions?
Let me just mention, a friend of mine is writing a new history of conservation in Florida, and he is going to be talking about American Beach in it.
Oh, wonderful.
Clay Henderson. So that's still going to press. Yes. So I know he's including that in his.
So we have another question. Any women or men of color that have worked on environmental issues that you came across? Are there Indigenous women included?
All right. So I'll answer the second one first. Cracking the Seminole Indian tribe is really hard to do. The women there's not a long written tradition, and it tends to be very male dominated. I did write some about some women club members who tried to and did fight for better reservation land for the Native people in Florida as well. But I have read essays written since then, but many of the Indigenous literature tend to be folk tales and kind of old traditional spiritual stories. So I haven't found, if you find that's the next book, you should write that book. If you can crack that would be a great book as well. Certainly there are women and men of color who've worked on environmental issues, again, in environmental justice. There are activists who were farm workers in Lake Apopka who were people of color and Latin backgrounds as well. Pensacola, Florida had a huge toxic waste dump that was made worse by the EPA's attempt to clean it up. And that involved an entire Black neighborhood. And Margaret Williams, who was a retired school teacher, is the one who led the challenge there, or led the charge to get the EPA to clean it up in a much more careful way, and ultimately got the federal government to buy out the neighborhood, to buy out the residents' homes that were so incredibly polluted. And so that was a really big moment. It was one of the first neighborhoods to get and it was a Black neighborhood, and they were following kind of the lead of Love Canal, which had been mostly whites. But they managed to, and they waged a fascinating war to get that neighborhood bought up and relocated. So yes, so there are some, but not as many as I would have liked to have found. And I did go looking, but I think that there's much more out there on that topic to be found.
Yeah, I really believe so. I mean, I think you could write an entire environmental history of Jacksonville with 2 chapters on environmental justice issues. And there's one that's playing out right now that dates at least to the turn of the century. And this relates to the lack of good water and sewer services in part of the African-American community in Jacksonville. And the state of Florida has only recently allocated $6 million to replace failing septic tanks on part of the northwest side of Jacksonville. It's a promise that's been delayed since the late 1960s when Jacksonville was first consolidated. And I have no doubt in my mind that the timing is not a coincidence. It has a lot to do with increased pressure on the mayor's office in the last 2 years in the wake of the George Floyd murder. And so there's some really fascinating stories playing out right now. Another question, please enlarge on the statement in your book intro. Grassroots work tends to free activists from any outside authority, allowing them to draw from their own morals to create their own approaches to issues.
Well, I think grassroots makes you kind of dangerous to the authorities, right? You are on the ground, you are seeing the problems, and when you work with other people, you find your power together instead of seeking it from the government or from whomever the leadership is in the community. And I mean, I do think that the best movements start at the bottom and push their way forward rather than having government tell you what to do. And I think that's what a lot of these grassroots groups did, is that they decided that this was a bad thing. I hate to keep going back to the Finn-Holloway River, but I found this news article in which the governor of Florida was in Taylor County, and he went and he was in downtown Perry, and he gave a press conference, and he made the comment, oh, the smell of a pulp mill, that smells like money to me. Well, that's not how it smelled to a lot of the citizens there. And certainly when the river started to smell like the pulp mill, that did not smell like money to Joy Ezell. It smelled to her like miscarriages and cancer and all kinds of health problems. Yeah. And so when you ignore, again, the governor and the city leaders telling you that this is what it is, instead as a grassroots group, you can push the envelope and try to create change.
Yeah, it reflects a very gendered language about what issues are important to different groups. More questions coming in. Audience question, you mentioned how women will fight for the health of their children, how there are women's groups presently that are fighting for green neighborhoods and clean environments for the better of their children. I don't know. Would you like to comment a little more on that, please? Well,
no, that they're out there. I mean, that's, if you want to get women engaged, I still think the health of the family tends to be the women's purview. And again, and I don't want to keep dissing the men. Yeah. I mean, certainly these women had to get male legislators to agree with them. They had to go in and convince them to pass the laws. So all hail to them for doing it. But sometimes the issues arise because women make it an issue that can't be ignored as well. And I still think one of my favorite examples is Carol Browner, who she grew up in Miami and worked in the state legislature as an attorney, and then ended up in Washington, D.C. as the head of the EPA during the Clinton administration. And she held that post for the longest of any EPA administrator. And when she was interviewed, or when she would go before Congress, quite often she would say, I care about what's happening with toxic waste because I'm a mother, I have a son, and this matters to me. And male Congress members would kind of laugh at her and kind of make fun of her. Well, what is that? But it resonated with the American public because we're parents, many of us, and we do care. And she was trying to illustrate that this is a multi-generational thing and you need to care. And so she in no way was embarrassed to say that, whereas she was, there was some heckling, I guess, about that. But she embraced that and was not afraid to say that. And I think that that's really important.
Another audience question: did the pollution from power plants in Jacksonville have long-term effects on the city and those who live there or live here? If so, what can we as citizens do to help make it better?
Well, I think that's a good question. And that deserves some health studies, probably. Air pollution is one of the hardest things to trace because you can't see it. You may not be able to smell it, and it has long-term impacts on lung health and on your heart health as well. Certainly people during this period in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s the state of Florida finally created a pollution control board, and they had hearings around the state. And there were people, women and men from Jacksonville who went and made pleas to please look at the air pollution. And, that certainly was part of the Clean Air Acts that have been enacted to try to control the pollutants from these areas. I don't have an answer to what the long-term health aspects were, but I just, in my gut, would say it had to. If it was to the point where it was melting nylon stockings, it had to be getting into your system.
And air pollution has been a huge problem in the history of Jacksonville, environmental history of Jacksonville. Other questions? I know there are probably others out there. I've got all sorts of ideas for topics I'd like to work on now.
Me too. That's the problem. I don't have time.
From audience members, join the Sierra Club. Yes, absolutely join the Sierra Club.
Again, I would say the number one thing to do is to vote. I think one of the biggest in the Sierra Club and the Audubon Society have moved beyond just a single topic into much broader topics looking at habitat and environment. Audubon Society is heavily involved in the Everglades cleanup. I would also say the League of Women Voters is still kicking some butt. They are understanding the politics of the environment, and when they get involved in battling for redistricting, that has an impact on the environment because that's going to have an impact on who gets elected. And I'm in Orange County, and I can tell you that in the last 2 elections, there have been some really interesting things that have happened. Orange County adopted a right to clean water amendment. Some people didn't pay enough attention to, but it passed by, I think, over 80% of the vote. And it really startled the county commission. And at the same time, a county commissioner who'd been very pro-growth got ousted in favor. Well, actually, in the last 2 county commission elections, 2 commissioners have been ousted in favor of environmental advocates. And I think that has created an atmosphere, at least here, of, we better pay attention to what the electorate is saying because they are making themselves known. And so that's been a really interesting thing to see here on a local level. I still think that the vast polling of Floridians environment is really near the top of their concerns. And I think if COVID has taught us nothing else, it's that our green spaces are precious. And in hard times, we find a lot of psychic relief and help by being out in nature, especially when you're stuck in your house, right? I mean, the park use in my area has just gone crazy. I can't go do any of my usual hikes because everybody is out there. And I think it's made my local government interested in how to create more green space or protect what's out there. Oh, yes. So someone just said, it was 89% of the vote for the right to clean water. And again, that's I believe that's being mimicked in one of those 5 amendments that are part of the new drive now.
And didn't the governor or the state legislature try to issue the governor tried to issue an executive order that said this couldn't be enforced or something like that? I know they did something like that.
Yeah, there's still a lot of messing around with that.
Very polarized. But
look at the people in Key West discovered when the cruise ships weren't coming into town, that suddenly their water cleared up and they're along the edge of the city, and how beautiful it was. And then they wanted to ban or at least limit the number of cruise ships coming through, and the state legislature passed a law telling them they couldn't do that. So, locals understand their environmental needs, I think, in a good way, but it's when we start limiting them.
And I can't reiterate enough what you said about get active in politics, register to vote and vote. It makes a difference. If you believe your county commissioners are not listening, get rid of them and get some new county commissioners.
Or run for office. Good people to run who aren't beholden to anybody, who are going to speak their mind and be brave. Like these women, they weren't employed. Their employers couldn't fire them, right? They were kind of dangerous, dangerous women.
I wonder if another topic someday, this is for your fourth book down the road, might be something about women whistleblowers at state agencies like DEP and the water management districts, because I know that's been an issue for the last few years. Let's see. Audience member adds, North Florida Land Trust in Jax also environmentally active, for instance, recently in St. Johns River buying intercoastal islands. Yes, that's wonderful. There is a lawsuit. Audience member adds, see Florida Rights of Nature Network, a fairly new legal theory. I think this is really important and really interesting what's happening. People waking up to this beautiful place we live in being paved over very quickly, but you can absolutely make a difference. And one thing I really like is showing how you can absolutely make a difference in a really male-dominated world.
Yeah, one of my favorite women activists was actually, her husband was president at Rollins College where I teach, and she was an early member of the Florida Audubon Society, and she described these women as going to Tallahassee and engaging in what she called sand spur tactics. She said, to the point where the men knew the women weren't going to go away. And so they just went ahead and passed the women's agenda so that they could get on with like their barbecues and whatever. But it was, I just loved the fact that they were, using that kind of language and all. And I'm talking about before the vote again, that these women were going to go to Tallahassee and they were going to walk the halls and they were going to make the men crazy until they listened to them. And sometimes that's what we have to do.
Okay.
All right. So let me put one more little plug in here. I didn't get a chance really to talk about Marjorie Harris Carr. We talked about it peripherally, and she was fighting to stop the Cross Florida Barge Canal. A dam that was built there that did disrupt part of the Ocklawaha River is still in existence. It has outlived its expiration date, and there's a huge movement afoot to try to get rid of this dam, which provides no electrical power, no water. It's simply there because of this abandoned waterway. And if you're interested in that, the Florida Defenders of the Environment have started up a huge campaign to try to get this dam removed. And that's something in North Florida that you might have great interest in, because if the Ocklawaha is restored, then the St. Johns River will be back to being connected all the way to Silver Springs, which used to be a huge tourist route. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote travel stories about it. And it also would include better water flow from the Ocklawaha into the St. Johns River, which again, we're worried about the quality of the river in Jacksonville. So there are a lot of issues in Jacksonville and across Florida that you can get involved in, and I would encourage you to do it. You just gotta get started.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'll go ahead and wrap this up. So I want to thank Dr. Poole and Dr. Klossman for being here today.
Happy to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was a great conversation.